I couldn't take my eyes off him when he climbed up on that stage with the guitar. My chest felt like it was going to burst out of my ribs. The church's air conditioning hummed and didn't touch the heat that rose up my neck. He adjusted the mic and for a second, just a heartbeat, I was back in Jacob's diner, watching him study a menu like every dollar mattered. My name is Ruth Abernathy. I'm 68, widowed 7 years, and I live alone in Greenwood, Tennessee. I've gone to Riverside Baptist for almost 30 years. For most Sundays my ritual is simple. Service, then the diner, a turkey sandwich, sweet iced tea, and a chapter of whatever book I'm carrying. I like the routine. It steadies me. That October afternoon, the diner smelled of frying oil and coffee, with the sweet, cloying scent of pies cooling under glass. The bell above the door chimed as I came in. He was at a corner booth, shoulders hunched under a coat that had seen better winters. He kept scanning the prices, running a finger along the edge of the menu like he could erase the numbers. When he didn't meet my eyes, I thought of Frank and how he used to say, "A man shouldn't eat on an empty belly." It was a small thought, and then I was already leaning toward Donna, the waitress, and whispering, "I'll pay for the young man's lunch too. Please don't tell him who it was." Donna nodded, eyes soft. I remember the clink of silverware as she carried the check back, the way the fluorescent lights made the laminate table look like a stage. I slipped a 5 and some singles across the counter and left with a smile hush in my chest. I hadn't sought notice. I didn't want a thank you or a sermon. I just wanted him to have a warm meal. A week later, the church leaves were on fire, red and orange against the clear October sky. Pastor Gregory announced that the usual musician was sick. He told us a young man would substitute. My stomach dropped when the doors behind the choir opened and David Matthews walked out. Same slouched coat posture, same unease when he scanned the room. But his shirt was clean. His hair was shorter. There was callus on his fingertips that caught the light when he strummed the first chord of Amazing Grace. Sound filled the sanctuary, wood and wire and breath. The hymn folded around us, and I felt the old, predictable wash of worship. Then he leaned to the microphone. His voice was quieter than his guitar, but it carried every wayward mile he'd walked. "Before we go on," he said, and the room tightened. "Last week, after visiting this church for the first time, I went to the diner down the street. I hadn't eaten in 2 days. I was worrying about the cheapest thing on the menu when the waitress came and told me someone had paid. Silence dropped like a heavy hymn book. I could hear Eleanor beside me, the rustle of her dress and the faint scent of the gardenias she always wears. My hands trembled around the hymnal. Its leather familiar under my fingers, my butterfly brooch warm against my chest. I prayed quietly that he wouldn't turn those words into a spotlight that landed on me. "It was the first meal I'd had in 2 days," he continued, throat tight. "I don't know who the person was, but whoever she is, if she's here, thank you. You fed more than my stomach that day." Pastor Gregory's voice softened behind him. "That's what our faith looks like," he said. "Small acts, big difference." Their words settled like dust motes in a sunbeam. I tried to shrink into the pew, to let the moment pass as other congregants shifted and murmured. Eleanor nudged my arm with an accusing, delighted elbow. "Wasn't that you?" she whispered, but I only shook my head. The sound I wanted to make wouldn't come out. After the benediction, the church filled with the shuffle of shoes, the clack of hymnals closing, the metallic clink from the coffee urn in the foyer. I tried to slip out the side door. The pastor intercepted me. His hand soft on my elbow, eyes kind but curious. "Ruth, could you stay a moment? David wants to talk about a new outreach idea." We moved into the back room where the light was softer, and the scent of lemon cleaner lingered. The leaders were already gathered, papers stacked, murmuring plans. Then David walked in. Up close, his face carried the small, stubborn map of someone who'd been through a lot. He looked at me longer than necessary, as if trying to place a face in the public up against a memory. "Was it you?" he asked, not quite a question, his voice low enough that only I could hear. For a beat my mouth went dry. My fingers found the rim of my hymnal, the worn edge of the page like a lifeline. I started, and the word caught in my throat like a sermon I couldn't finish. I thought of Frank's laugh, of the brooch I pin on Sundays because it belonged to my mother. I thought, unexpectedly, of the note folded into his receipt, words I didn't remember writing but must have. Welcome whoever you are. God loves you. He drew a crumpled scrap from his pocket and unfolded it as if it were fragile. The ink was smudged, but the words were there. The paper smelled faintly of diner grease and coffee. When he held it out, his hands trembled a little, and there was an urgency in his eyes that made me see, painfully clear, what a single small thing can do. Please, he said, let me thank you properly. His voice wasn't seeking praise. It was seeking a human connection, an acknowledgement that he mattered. Around us, the room seemed to hold its breath, the click of a clock the only sound for a long second. I could feel my breath, the quick, uneven rise and fall like a bird in a cage. I nodded. The nod was small. My throat burned. Outside, the sanctuary doors opened and sunlight poured in, cutting across the carpet like a promise. The moment bent, and I knew nothing after this would be quite the same. I couldn't take my eyes off him when he climbed up on that stage with the guitar. My chest felt like it was going to burst out of my ribs. The church's air conditioning hummed and didn't touch the heat that rose up my neck. He adjusted the mic and for a second, just a heartbeat, I was back in Jacob's diner, watching him study a menu like every dollar mattered. My dears, thank you so much for spending this little bit of time with me. I have to be honest. This channel is still taking its first steps, and every new subscription is a breath of life as we chase our first goal of 1,000 subscribers. If this story touches you, please consider clicking subscribe and tell me in the comments which city you're watching from. I love knowing where you all are. The mornings before that Sunday were always the same kind of gentle. The kettle would click off, and the little kitchen clock above the sink would tick like a metronome for my day. Light came through the east window in a pale ribbon, the kind of October light that makes dust look holy. I stood there with my mug cupped between both hands and listened to the house wake, pipes settling and old floorboard complaining down the hallway, and it felt like prayer, only steadier. I am 68 now, widow for 7 years. Frank's chair still sits at the head of our table, an empty silhouette I have learned to ignore and to honor in the same breath. My children live in other states. They call when they can. They send pictures of grandchildren. Sundays are the place where the sound of my life is held. Riverside Baptist isn't just a building. It's a ledger of birthdays, funerals, casseroles dropped at doors, and promises whispered over hospital beds. I know everyone's favorite hymn and the exact time the choir coughs. I know Pastor Gregory's pause before he says brothers and sisters, and the way Eleanor always manages to sit one pew in front of me, wearing something bright, her perfume a little too generous. That Saturday I folded my dress with careful fingers, the soft blue I save for October, the one that makes the silver butterfly brooch look like it belongs to me and to something older. The brooch was my mother's. I pin it near my heart as if the metal could keep the people I love from drifting away. I lined up my hymnal on the small shelf by the door, checked that my keys were where they always are and set out my shoes. Routine steadies grief. Routine keeps me upright. The kitchen smelled of coffee, real not the instant stuff, and toast. The TV murmured the morning news in the other room, but I barely heard it. Outside, the church bell on Main Street rang for the mid-morning service. 3 slow, lilting peals that hollowed into something like an invitation. I tucked a handkerchief into my purse, smoothed the collar of my dress, and left. The walk to Riverside is only a few blocks. By the time I reached the brick steps, the burgundy curtain behind the pulpit was already pulled slightly to one side, as it always is, revealing the brass cross and the single white candle that we keep burning through the winter months. Those small things, the color, the metal, the flame, are like punctuation marks in my life. They tell me when to pause. I have a seat I have claimed. On Saturday evening I stuffed a casserole in the church freezer for the community dinner the following week. I have been on the outreach committee for more than a decade. Coffee pots, meal trains, the names of the shelters in town memorized in my head like prayer beads. I know hunger isn't only about food. I've seen it be a hollowness that follows people for years. Still, a warm plate has a way of making the hollowness speak up and say, "Hold on." There was a note on the bulletin board by the fellowship hall, offset from the flyers about the bake sale and the upcoming holiday choir. It had the usual scrawl from Pastor Gregory. Musicians needed occasionally, call if you can help. I remember thinking nothing of it at the time. We have a steady man who leads us most weeks. Musicians come and go. The church is a river. People float in and out. I folded the bulletin and tucked it into my bag because I like Pastor Gregory's handwriting. He has a way of making ink feel like invitation. On Sunday morning I did the small, careful rituals. I pinned the brooch, smoothed the skirt down over my knees, inhaled Eleanor's gardenia perfume as she breezed by. The sanctuary smelled of lemon cleaner and old hymnals, of polished wood and the faint trace of incense. Though we don't use it, someone had once brought a prayer shawl in from a trip and its scent hasn't quite left the fabric of the place. That smell anchors me. The light through the high windows made lines on the carpet where dust motes drifted like tiny constellations. And yet, as familiar as everything was, there was an alertness in me that morning I couldn't name. Maybe it was the empty chair at the head of the table at home. Maybe it was a tenderness for the people who will always be passing through. Or maybe it was simply the day itself, October with a hush before winter. Small things add up. The bell's third ring that drew me in, the way the burgundy curtain leaned a little more to the left than usual, the candle's flame trembling in draught. They were whispers that something would alter the neatness of my routine. I did not know how. Later that afternoon, at the diner under the fluorescent hum and the smell of frying grease, I watched a young man count the prices on a laminated menu like they were prayer beads. His shoulders hunched as if the coat he wore was trying to weigh him flat into the booth. I remember thinking, without drama and without fanfare, that Frank used to say, "A man shouldn't eat on an empty belly." It was a small memory, an ordinary compass, and it guided me to the end of my purse. The rest, as they say, is what happened next, and what would catch up to us in ways I couldn't have imagined. The pastor's hand on my elbow felt warmer than I expected. It was a steady, plain pressure. His way of anchoring me, I think, while his eyes, always so careful, searched my face like he was looking for a prayer there. "Ruth, could you stay a moment? David wants to talk about an outreach idea," he said. His voice held that soft military cadence that makes people listen. I nodded before I thought about whether I wanted to. The back room smelled of lemon cleaner and spilled coffee, the scent of a place that hosted meetings and casseroles and late-night grief. Fluorescent lights hummed. Paper stacks made little cliffs on the folding table. The leaders sat with papers and pens, faces patient and expectant. My hymnal was in my hands, its leather warm where I'd been clutching it. My butterfly brooch pressed a familiar weight against my chest. My fingers wouldn't stop fidgeting with the edge of a page. My hands were colder than the room, and there was a tiny tremor in my right thumb. He came in like someone arriving late for a train. Up close, David's face was smaller than it had seemed from the pews. A map of tired roads, a careful jaw, eyes that held too much and too little all at once. He scanned the room and then he looked straight at me. The air shifted. I felt it in the back of my neck, as if someone had turned a warm lamp down to a whisper. "Was it you?" he asked, but the words weren't a question. They landed in front of me like a fish I wasn't sure I wanted to touch. My chest tightened. I could hear my own pulse in the quiet thump, 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 like someone tapping out a new hymn. I could smell the dinner grease on that crumpled note he'd brought, a faint, greasy breath of Jacob's diner. For an instant I thought of Frank, of his voice low and clear at the kitchen table. A man shouldn't eat on an empty belly. The memory sat between my ribs like a small coin, heavy and certain. I had told myself I did it to be invisible. That was the whole point, to give and step back, like the story of the widow in Sunday school who left a small coin in the collection and didn't seek a parade. I hadn't wanted eyes on me. I hadn't wanted sermons that turned me into a cautionary tale or a banner for the outreach committee. I wanted him to have a meal, and that should have been enough. David came closer, and when he unfolded the scrap of paper it made a brittle little sound. The ink was smudged at the corners, but the words were there: welcome, whoever you are. God loves you. I had written those words. I tried to remember the movement, the way my hand might have hesitated over the pen, the odd tenderness that had made me tuck the receipt into the pocket of my purse. The memory was hazy, like a photograph left in the sun. I had acted on impulse, and now the impulse had become a story with teeth. Please, he said, looking at me with a steadiness that had nothing to do with performance. It wasn't gratitude seeking applause. It was someone asking to be seen. Let me thank you properly. I felt every eye in the room slide to me. Pastor Gregory's weighty gaze, the stiff posture of the outreach coordinators, Eleanor's bright face peeking through the doorway. The small room seemed to breathe around me. My hands were suddenly clammy. There was a hollow somewhere under my ribs. I could have said no, walked out the door, gone back to my pew and the anonymity I had cherished. But I could see, as if lifted for a moment, the path that small kindness had already set. The ragged edge of a man who had slept 2 nights without a warm meal. A guitar on a pew. A song that had softened the sanctuary. These were consequences, good ones, and they were linked to me by the thinnest thread. It meant more than the sandwich, David whispered. It meant somebody noticed me. Those words made my throat close. Noticed. I had given because I noticed. I had given because I remembered what it felt like to be seen and not quite held. My breath came shorter. I felt the heat rise in my face as if I had gone out into the sun. The thought of being labeled, paraded as a saint, made my stomach churn. I was not a ledger of good deeds. I was a woman who liked routine and a good cup of tea and a quiet pew at the third seat from the back. But when he reached for my hands, his grip was honest and trembling, and I felt something uncoil. Pastor Gregory's voice, low and sincere, filled the small pause. What Ruth did, that's the church, he said. He didn't say hero or angel. He just said the word that makes our work human. The simplicity of it steadied me. I inhaled. The room was a prism of smells and sounds. Lemon, paper, the faint perfume of someone who'd passed through from the sanctuary. My heart was racing, but the rhythm of it was steadier than before. I thought of Frank's empty chair and how many times his silence had taught me how to notice others. I thought of the note, my handwriting maybe, but more the impulse behind it. I remembered folding my dress the night before, pinning the brooch, walking across the church lawn and feeling the light hit the candle behind the pulpit. Little acts stitched my days together. All right, I said, my voice surprisingly small and sure. It was not a public announcement. It wasn't a confession to be made from the pulpit. It was a decision that slid out of me like a key into a new lock. Stay and tell him. Tell him I was the one who paid. There was a kind of exhale in the room that might have been relief or gratitude or both. David's eyes softened until they were almost wet. Eleanor squeezed my shoulder like she always did when words cost me. Pastor Gregory smiled, not preachy, just honest, as if a plan had found its next step. Later I would feel the ripple of that nod in ways I hadn't imagined. People stopping me in grocery aisles, letters left on my doorstep, the nickname that Emma from choir would wink about. In that moment, though, I simply felt the warmth of 2 hands holding mine, and the impossible smallness of how a turkey sandwich bought under a counter lamp could open a door wide enough for a man to walk through. I can still feel the scrape of the folding chair under my knees the first time we sat together in that back room. The fluorescent light made everyone look a little tired, and the lemon-scented cleaner clung to the air like a second skin. David stood by the table, his guitar case leaning against a stack of paper plates. He didn't look like a man asking for a favor. His eyes didn't look for praise. They looked for permission to be seen without being judged. There was a steadiness in him then that had nothing to do with youth or charisma. It had everything to do with hunger and humility. Pastor Gregory cleared his throat softly from the doorway, his presence folding around the moment like a choir robe. David has some ideas about a music outreach, coffeehouse nights, a few meals for folks downtown, he said, and the committee leaned forward, interest bright on their faces. Eleanor, of course, leaned too, closer than anyone should, perfume like a flare. Oh, Ruth, we should tell your story in the bulletin. Folks love a good testimony, she chirped, voice all sugar. Her elbow pressed into my ribs. I glanced at her, and she smiled the smile that meant business done. I started and stopped. I felt the old instinct to be small, to let a good deed float away without anchor. It was nothing, I said, softer than I meant to. My throat tightened. The butterfly brooch at my collar warmed against my chest as if it had a pulse. David watched me, a small, almost mischievous look at the corner of his mouth. It wasn't nothing to me, he said. It was the first time somebody looked at me and didn't see my bad choices. They just saw me. There was a hush, and then Mrs. Langley from the outreach table hummed, half to herself. What a blessing, she said, but there was another voice under it, the one that always sits at the edge of church rooms like a draft. Quiet, cautious. Bridget, who runs the thrift closet, folded her arms. Do we know his references? Where he plans to stay? Her question wasn't unkind, but it carried the weight of all the caution we've learned the hard way. Her lips thinned. She looked at David as if trying to read a page with the light off. He didn't bristle. He answered slowly, not defending himself so much as offering a map. I've been working odd jobs. I have a cousin in Nashville who said I could check in there if things don't pan out. I want to work. I'm studying music at the community college when I can. I'm not trying to be a charity case. The subtext hummed between the words. I want to be useful. I am trying. It made my throat ache. Pastor Gregory's hand landed lightly on my shoulder. Ruth, would you consider helping with the outreach design? You've been doing community dinners for years. Your experience. His voice framed the suggestion as honor, but I felt the old heat of embarrassment at being placed on a pedestal. I felt some people in the room look at me differently after that. They softened, sometimes to the point of pity. Others searched for something to tighten their hands around. Policy, procedure, something practical to hold when compassion could feel messy. It was the way faith communities are. Ready to give, wary of being harmed, proud and fragile all at once. Later, alone at my kitchen table with the kettle still warm and the house settled around me, I replayed David's hands in my memory. His fingers traced the scrap of paper like it was scripture. The words on that receipt, "Welcome whoever you are. God loves you," sat on my tongue as if I'd tasted them before and not known I had. The next Sunday, David played from the front of the church. His voice found the pews like soft light. People leaned in. I watched him in the song, the way his thumb paused on a chord as if listening, and felt a tenderness I hadn't expected. Afterward, as members came up to thank him, their words braided with mine. Gratitude, admiration, a flurry of invitations. Everyone wanted a piece of the story. Not all of it sat well. A few weeks in, I heard someone whisper in the foyer that perhaps we were doing too much, that a young man with a guitar could stir hearts and then disappear. The suspicion felt like a cool hand on the back of my neck. I heard it and I resented it, not for David, but for the way suspicion can flatten generosity into an accounting sheet. So I started to speak up, small at first. At committee meetings I suggested clearer roles. A place for David to practice, a schedule for meals, volunteers to check in on folks who come through our doors. It wasn't a curtain call. It was a scaffold. When I laid it down, people could hold on without falling overboard. David noticed. He watched me with that same quiet attentiveness, and once he said, "Eyes honest, you don't have to be invisible." I thought of Frank's chair at the head of my table, the empty space I'd learned to make for others. I thought of my brooch, of the way it catches light and refuses to hide. We began to meet once a week, just the two of us, planning the coffeehouse nights. He'd hum a melody and I'd tap the edge of a napkin, the rhythm of someone who knew how to build. Our conversations were threaded with small hesitations, things unsaid or half said. He never asked for more than I could give. I never offered more than felt right. And even when gossip curled like smoke at the edges of the fellowship hall, even when some eyes questioned whether a turkey sandwich could be the thing to change a life, I kept seeing the man with the guitar hold a folded scrap of paper to his chest and breathe as if he'd been given permission to stay. Those quiet moments, his calluses, the faint scar by his eyebrow, the way he swallowed before a line, stayed with me like photographs. I had not sought recognition. I still do not. But I learned in small stubborn ways that a hidden gift doesn't disappear when it is named. It becomes a hinge. It opens something, tables, doors, the slow, careful acts that hold a town together. And sometimes when your hands tremble from age and you think you have nothing left to offer, the most you can do is notice someone who needs to be seen, and then be brave enough to let others see you noticing. After a few Sundays, the warmth that had followed David's first song cooled into something tight and watchful. It started with small things. The almost imperceptible shift in the foyer when I came in. People who used to reach for my hand now offered a quick nod, their eyes sliding past me as if looking directly at me were a risk. The handshake line that used to be a slow braid of elbows and greetings became a scatter. People moving around me the way you step aside for a puddle. I noticed it first at the coffee urn. Mrs. Callahan used to set a cup aside with an extra chocolate for me. One week she busied herself with napkins and avoided my aisle. Eleanor would catch my eye and smile, but the smile had a new tightness, like a mouth trying not to say something. "Oh, Ruth," she mouthed once, but then her lips closed as if she'd swallowed a whole sentence. Whispers unraveled like thread in the pews. They were soft, never meant to reach my ears, and yet somehow they did. I could feel them when I crossed the sanctuary. Little waves of hushed breath, the way heads would tilt together, then snap apart. Someone would clear their throat loudly just as I passed. A hand would purse the bulletin the way someone clamps a mouth shut. Once, a woman I had delivered a casserole to every winter for 15 years gave me a thin smile and hurried out the side door, clutching her purse like a shield. I stood on the sidewalk and watched the door swing shut behind her. The bell's ring seemed colder that week. At the committee meetings, the change was quieter but sharper. Where conversation had once been easy and fidgeted with casseroles and cap tables, now the minutes filled with questions that felt like inspections. "Do we have references?" Bridget asked, not unkindly, but with the hardness of someone holding a ledger against a hymn. She used the word "we" like a barrier. Another volunteer raised concerns about liability, about setting precedents. Practicalities, they said. Policy. I sat there, my hymnal folded in my lap like a small, familiar shield, and listened as my good deed became a list of risks. Pastor Gregory tried to steady the room. He has a voice that will not be hurried. "We will care for people wisely," he said, and I could hear him balancing compassion with caution as pastors do. He came to me afterward, his hand a steady pressure on my shoulder. "Ruth," he said quietly, "thank you." His eyes held something like regret. "But there will be questions." The regret landed like a cool hand. It wasn't condemnation. It wasn't even blame. It was the simple friction of two truths: that kindness can unsettle the tidy edges of a community, and that a church, like any family, often chooses caution over chance. Gossip, I learned, is its own weather. First it was a breeze. Then it became a drizzle that soaked into wood and cloth. It wounded me in ways that were not loud. I am not brittle exactly. I have been widowed. I know how to sit with loss. But there is a particular ache when the place that has held your life for decades starts to look at you, as if you are a question instead of a neighbor. I lay awake some nights, thinking of the scrap of paper David had kept in his pocket, the smudged words that might have been my own handwriting. I kept wondering if my impulse, so small and ordinary in my mind, had been a misstep into something the church wasn't ready to hold. Yet even as doors seemed to close, other doors opened in quieter ways. A young man in the children's ministry nodded at me from across the hall, just a twitch of his chin, but it said, "I saw you." David himself never changed toward me. If anything, he watched me with a new kind of care, as if he wanted to protect me from the recoil of the room. When we planned meals, he would bring extra napkins and fold them with his callous fingers, clumsy and precise. Once he handed me a cup of coffee without a word. The gesture felt like a benediction. I tried to answer the whispers with action, not words. I kept helping at the community dinners. I wrote polite, plain replies to a few worried notes. I suggested policies at meetings that would make people feel safer. "We can have background checks," I offered. "We can have a check-in schedule." Some of the suggestions were met with relief, others with further suspicion, as if my eagerness to systematize charity disproved the spontaneity of my original act. The more I tried to make it tidy, the more I felt the seams of the congregation strain. What hurt most was not the talk, but the unintended loneliness. I began to notice the coldness of pews where warm bodies used to sit with me. I found myself taking the long way to the restroom to avoid a cluster of voices. Once, in the grocery aisle, a woman I had baked pies with for years crossed to the other side when she saw me. Her hand trembled on the cart as if she feared contagion. I stood there among cans of tomatoes and felt very small. Still, every Sunday when David tuned his guitar and sang, there was a hush that made the rest of the world seem narrow. For those minutes, the sanctuary felt like the place it had always been, a shelter that holds a fragile, faithful sound. I could see faces soften, people leaning in despite themselves. And somewhere in that leaning I found a reason to stay. The community's suspicion might be loud, but the music reminded me why we gather: to be seen, to be mended, to be given a chance. The sermon is thick in the air, Pastor Gregory's voice like a low bell, the resonance moving through the pews and into my ribs. I can feel the vibration against the hymnals, the tiny tremor under my palms where they rest folded on my lap. He talks about mercy and wisdom, and the words roll over the sanctuary like winter wind against clapboard. "We are to be generous," he says, and then softer, "and we are to be wise." The pulpit smells of old varnish and lemon polish, of the cedar the church was built with and the years of hands that have leaned there. There is a coffee aftertaste in the back of the air, the faint ghost of sugar and cream that clings to our Sundays. Somewhere near the organ someone coughs. A child shifts in the choir loft. The sound is ordinary until it isn't. Until every ordinary creak seems to wait for something. I hold my hands together until the knuckles blanch. Fingers interlaced, thumb rubbing the inside of my palm. An old private prayer. I keep my breath small. In, out. In, out. The room tightens with attention. I am trying to be invisible and present all at once. I am trying to be brave. Careful stewardship. Pastor Gregory continues, his cadence steady, the resonance of his voice moving past me and back again. We cannot feed the impulse without thinking of consequences. A rustle. The whisper starts like a moth. Two people leaning in, a name, the soft, precise consonant of Bridget from the thrift closet. But what about references? How do we know? It is not loud. It is not meant to be. But it spreads. Then the draft comes, subtle, sudden, the side door giving on someone arriving late. The flame of the single candle by the brass cross gutters. I hear it, the small wet sound like a coin dropped in a cup. The light goes out. For a breath, the sanctuary holds its breath with me. Wood answers wood. The small wooden crucifix that hangs behind the pulpit shifts and comes free. It falls with a harsh, honest clap against the wooden floor, then rolls and stops as if exhausted. The sound seems to ring forever. It is a ridiculous thing, a slip of a nail, yet it lands like an accusation. People make the little animal sound we make when something sacred seems to falter. A rusted hinge groans. In the hush that follows the fall, the varnish smell deepens into something metallic and bright, like the edge of a bell. All at once the murmurs swell. Questions sharpen into sentences. Did she? Was it wise? What if? The room becomes a net of voices and I am the small thing caught in the weave. Heat rushes up my neck. I can feel the air like a hand on my throat. My breaths come quicker despite my attempts to lengthen them. My palm finds the silver butterfly at my chest and fingers squeeze as if to hold the brooch in place. I keep my lips shut. Saying anything feels like stepping out into a storm. My hands tremble so slightly that the hymnbook's leather rubs against my wrist. I think of Frank's empty chair. I think of that greasy receipt folded into a pocket, the smudged words I may have written: welcome, whoever you are. God loves you. I remind myself why I did it. It is not courage I feel. It is a stubborn, foolish, ordinary kind of mercy. Then I hear David's boots on the floorboards. He stands where the choir aisle meets the platform, guitar case like a second heart at his side. For a second I simply look at him, calloused fingers, the faint scar at his brow, and I see how much he has been carrying. He nods, the tiniest thing, not to the committee chair or the whispers, but to me. He does not ask permission. When he speaks, his voice slides through the room differently than Pastor Gregory's sermon. It carries an edge of lived hunger. I want to say something. He begins, and you can feel the silence assemble into a listening. His words ride the echo of the chapel. That sandwich was the first meal I had in 2 days. It wasn't just food. It was proof that someone could look at me and not see my worst moments. The resonance of his voice makes the wood under my feet answer. His words vibrate across the hymnals and they land like small stones. He is not pleading. He is naming. I am not a story you should fear. I'm a person who was given a chance. There are faces that soften in the pews. There are faces that hold their shape like coins in a jar. Someone reaches down and picks up the small crucifix and sets it, more carefully than it had hung, back to its place. The candle's wick catches again. Another volunteer, or the air changing as people breathe, and the flame is a small stubborn heartbeat in the dim. Pastor Gregory steps forward then, palms out in that caped calm he wears from years of trying to be both shepherd and shield. We will be cautious, he says, and the way he says it is not blame. But we will not let fear be our first sermon. My hands unclench. My breathing is still fast but steadier. I taste metal and old fear, and something else like rain on dry earth. People look at each other. Some eyes turn toward me with warmth. Others with the hard, practical look of people measuring risk. I am not healed. The crucifix's fall has shown a seam. The whispering has not gone away. But for a moment, long enough to matter, David's voice and Pastor Gregory's steadiness stitch the seam a little tighter. I feel that small repair the way you feel a patch on a favorite jacket. Not new but mended. My hands find the hymnal again. The leather is warm. I close it slowly. Outside, the church bell gives 3 clear peals. They sound like a promise or a warning. Perhaps both. My heart is still beating too fast. I can still feel the draft on my cheek where the candle blew out. But I can also feel the weight of a hand, David's, calloused and certain, resting for a second on the back of the pew in front of me, an anchor I did not know I needed. We lift our heads together, and the next hymn begins, soft, fragile, and then as more voices join, a rising that feels like repair. The wooden crucifix clattered to the floor and the room inhaled as one. For a second there was nothing but that hollow sound and the tiny, ridiculous flutter of a candle going out. Then the hush crescendoed into talking, soft at first. There was a weight to the ordinary truth. It landed on the varnished wood, on hymnals, on the little faces bent forward. You could see the math of suspicion trying to run through it. What about references? What about precedent? And then you could see those calculations stumble against something older: hunger, fatigue, the ache of being unseen. He folded his hands around the neck of the guitar, as if to steady himself. "I kept the receipt," he said, and from the pocket of his worn jacket he took the crumpled scrap of paper, the grease-smudged proof of a small kindness. He unfolded it with great care, like a relic. "It says, 'Welcome, whoever you are. God loves you.' I don't know who wrote it." He paused and his eyes found mine. "But I kept it, because it meant somebody saw me as a person. That piece of paper wasn't a miracle. It was evidence. It was what we already had. An accidental footprint left in ink. It tied a nameless act to a human face and made the abstract concrete. You could see how that changed things. Policies and fears are one thing. A receipt tucked into a pocket is another." Pastor Gregory stepped forward, his presence a quiet command. He balanced the ledger and the hymn book with a shepherd's steadiness. "We will be prudent," he said. "We will set boundaries. But we will not let fear keep us from feeding people." He didn't erase the questions. He simply refused to let them be the only answer. Some people softened right then, the ones who knew what it was to wait for help. Others didn't. That was life in a small-town church. Generosity and suspicion braided together, sometimes in the same breath. But what shifted in the room wasn't a sudden flood of unanimous approval. It was something quieter. People looked at the boy with the guitar and then at me, and for a few of them, their eyes changed from assessment to, if not understanding, then to a willingness to try. After the meeting, as the crowd thinned and the fluorescent lights hummed back into ordinary brightness, a few hands reached for mine. Not all. Not even most. But enough. Eleanor squeezed my elbow until I felt her mischievous grin through her perfume. "You did good, Ruth," she said, and the words were both accusation and apology. Outside, the October air was cold enough to make my breath hang. I had come wanting anonymity. I left understanding in a new way that being seen sometimes asks more courage than staying small. I am old enough to know the ache of being on the edge. I am old enough to know also that a simple kindness can set a domino line you didn't mean to start. That afternoon, the dominoes did not all fall the way I expected. Some toppled toward praise. Others toppled toward scrutiny. But the line moved, and that movement was itself a kind of grace. In the weeks that followed, we set up a small plan. A check-in schedule for volunteers, a roster for practice nights, an outreach committee that included kitchen duty and a background of common sense. It felt like knitting, stitching practicalities into charity so people could hold the work without fear. David took to the stage more often, not as a transient tale but as someone learning to stay. He wrote a song, soft and spare, that he played at the Thanksgiving dinner, the one where the church fed more than 100 people from the fellowship hall. He dedicated that song to the stranger who paid for a sandwich. He didn't point at me, but when his voice filled the room, I felt the lyrics as a benediction. The chorus was simple. Somebody looked my way. Somebody said I mattered. People wiped their eyes. Some of the ones who had been most suspicious sat still like stones softened by sun. I served plates that night. My hands were steady. The kitchen smelled of roast turkey and gravy and something less tangible, repair. David walked by with his guitar, and for a second his calloused hand rested on the back of my chair. The touch was quiet and grounding. "You don't have to hide," he said, as if he were naming something for both of us. I thought of all the small mercies I had been given over the years. Frank's steady laugh, Mrs. Callahan's pies, a neighbor who shoveled the walk without asking. I thought of the scrap of paper in David's pocket and how it had become a hinge. I thought, too, of the people who had recoiled, not out of malice but out of the neat, human fear that asks to protect what it knows. Being known is not the same as being paraded. There is dignity in being seen and simply being allowed to keep living. I had given a sandwich because I had noticed. For that simple noticing, awkward, imperfect human, I needed no halo. I needed only to accept that my small action had been true and that truth had ripple effects I could not fully control. So I stopped trying to disappear. I answered phone calls. I went to meetings. I baked for the dinners and listened as neighbors worked out the fragile business of caring for one another. When someone asked if I wanted the spotlight, I shook my head. But when someone reached out a hand like David did that night, I took it. We will always have our seams. We will always have the fall of a crucifix that scares us into seeing where things are loose. But the tape we put over the tear is not perfect. It is a small, honest patch, and it holds. The music keeps coming, and on some Sundays when the chords line up and the voices meet, I sit there and feel with the slow, certain wonder of someone who has lived a while that kindness, no matter how small, is never wasted. The weeks after Thanksgiving folded into ordinary days that felt somehow less ordinary. The church bulletin lists grew longer with names of volunteers. The coffee pot got used more. People learned how to ask practical questions without letting those questions become a wall. We drew up schedules, background checks, a check-in table at evening events. We made room for caution and for courage, both. Some Sundays the pews looked the same as they always had. Women in hats, men with Sunday papers tucked under their arms, but now there were new faces too. Young parents I remembered from VBS came back with teenagers. A few people from the shelter down on Main Street began to trickle in on cold mornings, wrapped in thrifted coats, clutching to-go cups with grateful hands. David played on most Sundays. He learned to tune the old piano by ear. He taught a few teenagers how to hold a pick without hurting their thumbs. The guitar case with stickers leaned against the amp like a small, patient animal keeping watch. Not everyone came around. Gossip does not dissolve overnight. I still felt the odd coolness in certain corners, the clipped hello, the hurried sidestep. But I noticed, because I had been trained by loss and by habit to look, that when suspicion hovered like a fog, it was often followed by something else. A hand that reached out, tentative, and found the one waiting. The same people who whispered also brought casseroles to the shelter dinner, left coins in envelopes, volunteered to drive someone to a doctor's appointment. Fear and generosity, it turns out, can live in the same heart. David kept the scrap of paper folded in his pocket. Sometimes I would catch him smoothing it with a thumb as he walked past me in the hallway. Once, when we were setting plates in the fellowship hall, he leaned down and said, quiet enough that the clatter of cutlery would hide it, "You don't have to hide, Ruth." It wasn't a plea. It was a permission. I tilted my head and felt something loosen, an old tension in my shoulders that had lived there since Frank died. I stopped trying to make myself invisible. I went to the meetings. I signed my name on the roster. I learned the new software the treasurer insisted on. I learned to say no when I had to, and yes when my hands could still hold a ladle steady. Eleanor still fussed, of course. Permanent elbow in my ribs. Perfume like gardenias on the wrong day and always on time. She called me our heroine, whenever she thought no one heard. I pretended to bristle, and then accepted her chocolate mints like the peace offerings they were. We started a monthly music night, a small thing at first. Hot chocolate, paper cups, a few folding chairs. Folks from around town came, some with guitars, some with poems, some with the kind of silence that only ears that have been listening can carry. The first night David stood under the string lights and played the new song he had written. Simple lines and an honest chorus. Somebody looked my way, somebody said I mattered. People wiped their eyes. I handed out napkins. It felt like a quiet confirmation that a single sandwich could tug at the seams of a life and, in doing so, stitch something else together. There were moments that surprised me. A mother who had always avoided the outreach table sat with me one afternoon and asked about volunteering. An old neighbor left a plate of pecan pie on my porch with a note that said, "We all need to be seen." Once, when I came to the sanctuary early, the janitor lifted the candle and set it near the cross as if making sure. Sometimes I would sit in my pew after service just to listen. The sanctuary smells, lemon, old wood, hymn books, are the same, but now the sound is layered. Voices that once prattled in the foyer now sometimes come back to sit under the rafters, and a stranger's cough is met by a hand placed gently on a shoulder. The choir still coughs at the same place in the third verse. Pastor Gregory still pauses before he says brothers and sisters, but there's a new softness there. He has a way of hearing things and letting us hold them, even if we cannot immediately fix them. The most ordinary mornings became small miracles. A child who had come in with a scuffed sneaker and a pulled-down cap once left a drawing on the back pew with a stick figure family under a sun. "For your brooch, lady," it said in a child's tilting script. I took it home and set it on my kitchen windowsill. It was not fame. It was not even recognition in the formal sense. It was a piece of someone else's mind saying, "I see you." It was enough. One evening after a practice, David and I walked out together. The October air was crisp and smelled like cut grass and the first promise of frost. The church doors were heavy oak with a brass handle polished by countless hands. He carried his case like a companion and I carried the small tote of notes I always have, pen, tissues, and extra mint. We stood on the brick steps for a moment. He adjusted his guitar strap and looked out across the parking lot, where the streetlight threw a small pool of gold. "Thank you," he said simply. He did not say it like a performance. He said it as if placing a pebble in a small quiet stream. I nodded. The wind picked up and made the trees in the yard shiver, their leaves rubbing together like people in prayer. We moved toward the door. He opened it. For a second everything changed: light, wood, the scent of old varnish. The sound of our footsteps carried differently on the threshold. Then he stepped inside. The door closed with a soft breath of wind that slid through the jamb and settled the small calendar of our days. I stayed on the stoop and watched him cross the aisle, the echo of his steps fading. The pews behind him were mostly empty now. One seat, third row from the back on the aisle, held the faint impression of where someone had sat. The hymnal lay open and then closed as if a hand had turned it. I put my hand to the butterfly brooch at my throat. Its metal was cool in the night air. I felt the memory of the diner, the smell of frying oil and coffee, and the small ordinary courage that had made me reach for my purse. I thought of dominoes tipped, some toward praise and some toward caution. I thought of the fall of the crucifix and the hands that replaced it. I thought of the scrap of paper tucked into a pocket and the way a person can carry a note like a prayer. The church bell sounded 3 slow peals, and the vibration went through the soles of my shoes into my bones. The wind caught the door again and shut it with a small decisive click, the kind of sound that marks an ending and also the opening of another room. I listened to the footsteps on the wooden floor fade, then disappear. The night folded around me like a shawl. I turned and walked away. Something had ended and something else had begun. The empty pew kept the shape of a life in gentle memory. The smell of lemon lingered in the air like a benediction. The wind took the sound of the closing door and pushed it down the lane until even that small echo went quiet. I walked home under the stars, my hands warm in my pockets, and I thought, all we ever have to do is notice. Then, if we are brave and a little foolish, we offer what we can. The rest is beyond our control. The rest is grace. I walked home that night with the brooch cold against my collar, and the memory of David's fingers lingering like a warmth I couldn't name. The streetlights threw small islands of gold on the sidewalk. Leaves skittered and whispered at my shoes. I kept thinking of the scrap of paper in his pocket, the grease stain at the corner, the crooked handwriting, and how something so ordinary had become a hinge for other people's lives. Days folded into weeks. The music nights grew from a handful of folding chairs into a small steady thing. People brought casseroles. Teenagers learned to tune a guitar. Somewhere between the third and fourth meeting, a man from the shelter got up and recited a poem about a pair of shoes that finally fit. There were tears then, mine and others, and for a moment the room was just breath and honest noise. I stood at the back holding the tray of cookies and felt less like an exhibit and more like a neighbor. Not everyone warmed. Gossip has its own gravity. It bends toward the smallest crack and widens it. I heard the sideways comments in the grocery store and felt them like a chill wind. I learned how to carry that chill and keep walking. I learned also that a few steady hands matter more than 100 wandering voices. Eleanor visited more often and brought mints in a plastic tin. Pastor Gregory found a way to say prudence and grace in the same sentence. Bridget started signing up for the coffee shift again. Small thaws. David settled into the front of the sanctuary like he had been there all along. His calluses became familiar to us the way a habit becomes comfortable, noticed in the way he tuned, in the careful pause before a song, in the little salute he gave me when our eyes met across a hymn. He wrote a handful of songs that sounded like the town. Simple lines, no frills. One afternoon he left the crumpled receipt on the piano, face down like a secret, and when I picked it up I could smell the diner for a second, coffee, frying oil, the thin paper giving under my fingers. I thought of the impulse that made me reach across the counter that day. I thought again of Frank and his steady hands. We built policy and we built trust. There were sign-up sheets, background checks, a check-in table at evening events, practicalities to hold the heart. People wanted to know the plan before they allowed themselves to feel. I understood that. I also understood how quickly procedure can suffocate mercy if you let it. So we folded both into what we did. The ledger and the hymn book side by side. Sometimes, late at night, I would set the kettle on and listen to it click and steam and think about the fall of the crucifix that first Sunday after the receipt was named. The thud had sounded absurdly accusing. It had also awakened something in us. A recognition that our hands are not perfectly steady, that our shelters have seams. We mended what we could and learned to live with the rest. People began bringing small reparations. A pie on my porch, a child's drawing left on the pew with the words "For your brooch, lady." An elderly neighbor who started asking about the music nights instead of listing reasons not to attend. Those small gestures felt larger than the display of thanks that had made me uncomfortable at first. They were private, awkward, sincere, like someone stepping into a room to see if the light still catches on the silver. The label of angel haunted me for a while. Folks called me that with soft eyebrows and loud gratitude, as if that three-syllable word could hold everything neat and holy. I would smile, tuck my hands into my purse and say, "I just bought him lunch." It never felt enough. But I learned that people need names for grace. They need language to hold the mystery. I let them have that name and kept my own quiet. There were moments of surprise, when a woman who had been the most suspicious at the committee meeting folded napkins at the next music night, when Pastor Gregory sat in the back and listened instead of steering, when David asked me to sit with him at a fundraiser and didn't let me slip away the moment anyone said my name. Those were small invitations to be seen without being put on a pedestal. They were the kind I could accept. I am older now. My days are slower and I notice more. The way light pools on the kitchen table, the particular creak in the third pew, the small shiver of a coat when someone walks in who has braved something worse than we can easily name. My children call on Sundays. My grandchildren sometimes bring drawings that look like stick figure sermons. I go to the diner still, though less often these days, and I think of that corner booth and the way fluorescent light can turn a small act into something the size of a town. Sometimes I worry about limits, mine and the church's. I worry about being used or misunderstood. I worry about the ways fear makes us tidy and small. Yet every time David's guitar starts and the room leans in, I remember what the stapled scrap of paper proved. A simple welcome can be the beginning of a life. The truth I carry is quiet. I did not act to be named. I acted because I noticed a human need, and because the habit of noticing had been taught to me by years of an ordinary faith. That impulse has shaped more than one Sunday. It has shifted how some of us feed each other, how we make room at our tables, how we talk about strangers who come through our doors. So if there is anything I would leave with you, Any small thing from a life that has learned to keep loving despite the risk. It is this. If you've made it this far, thank you from the bottom of my heart for staying until the end. If you feel it in your heart, please subscribe so you won't miss the next stories, and keep walking with me by watching the other videos I've prepared with care. And please, share in the comments what you thought of my testimony. I will read every word.